We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jenny Beeman. I'm the director of the Stonewall Center at UMass Amherst. And this event is being held to mark the publication of the SAGE Encyclopedia of Trans Studies, edited by myself and Abby Goldberg, a professor of psychology at Clark University. Want to pop on? There you are. I'm
All right, here. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see everyone, or not see everyone, but thank you for being here.
Yeah, and this event is sponsored by both of our institutions, Clark University and UMass Amherst. The encyclopedia contains 300 articles addressing a wide range of topics that intersect and affect the lives of trans people, including entries by today's panelists on Black people, Laverne Cox, Christine Jorgensen, career development, and pro athletes. After the event, you will receive an email containing links to the entries written by the panelists, as well as an order form to send to your college or local library. Now I'll hand it over to Emily Skidmore, an associate professor of history at Texas Tech University and an associate board member of the encyclopedia.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am so thrilled to be moderating today's session, which features brilliant scholars in our field. Just to give a quick sort of overview of what's going to happen today, after I introduce the panel, I'll ask 2 questions and our panelists will answer them in about 5 minutes each. And then we'll go on to take questions from the audience. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A bubble in Zoom. Feel free to use that to submit your questions to the panelists. Also, if you have any tech issues during today's panel, feel free to put those in the Q&A as well, and we'll do our best to get those addressed as quickly as possible. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished panelists. So first we have Marquis Bay, who is an assistant professor of African American Studies and English at Northwestern University. Their work focuses on Blackness and fugitivity, transness, and Black feminist theory. Marquis is the author of Anarcho-Blackness, Notes Toward a Black Anarchism in 2020, and Them Goon Rules, Fugitive Essays on Radical Black Feminism in 2019. They also have 2 works forthcoming, Black Trans Feminism from Duke University Press, and The Problem of the Negro as a Problem for Gender from the University of Minnesota Press. And for the SAGE Encyclopedia on Trans Studies, Marquis wrote the entry on Black people. Next, we have Erin Devore, who is the founder and inaugural chair in Transgender Studies, the founder and subject matter expert of the Transgender Archives, the founder and host of the Moving Trans History Forward conferences, and a professor of sociology, all at the University of Victoria. He has written numerous influential articles and is the author or editor of 5 books, including 2 classics in trans studies, Gender Blending, Confronting the Limits of Duality, and FTM, Female to Male Transsexuals in Society. For the encyclopedia, Erin wrote 3 entries, the entry on Harry Benjamin, Reed Erickson, and Virginia Prince. Next, we have Julian Cavone Glover, who is an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. Their research focuses on Black, brown, queer cultural formations, performance, ethnography, embodied knowledge, and performance theory. Julian completed their dissertation, To Be Real, Black and Latinx Transgender Women in the Ballroom Scene at Northwestern University in 2020. They've written articles on representation of trans women of color in the media and Black queer women femmes. For the encyclopedia, Julian wrote the entries on Laverne Cox and Janet Mock. Next, we have Chris Wren, who is a professor of higher adult and lifelong education and the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies for Student Success Research at Michigan State University. Her research focuses on the learning, development, and success of minoritized students in higher education. Chris is the author or co-author of 9 books about higher education, including Student Development in College, Theory, Research, and Practice, and College Students in the United States. She wrote the groundbreaking article, LGBT and Queer Research in Higher Education, The State and Status of the Field. For the Encyclopedia, Chris co-wrote entries on activism and career development and trajectories. And next we have Travers, who is a professor of sociology and anthropology at Simon Fraser University. Their research focuses on queer and trans theory, the sociology of sport, children and gender justice, social issues and movements, and gender and technology. Their recent books include Transgender Athletes in Competitive Sports and The Trans Generation, How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution. They have also written widely on the relationship between sport and social justice. For the Encyclopedia, Travers wrote the entry on athletes in pro sports. I'm so excited to hear from everyone on the panel. So let's get right to it with the first question. The first question is, what, in your mind, is the current state of the field of trans studies? And to be more specific, what questions do you see as animating current discussions and debates? Are there particular works recently published that you think best encapsulate where the field is in 2021? I know it's a big question, but there's multiple points of entries. So I'm excited to hear what you all think. And I'd love for you to go in the order that I introduced you in. So that means Marquis, you would be first up. Would you mind going first, Marquis?
Sure. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for having me on this panel with such wonderful, wonderful people. And I'll try to keep my responses brief. I'm always interested in hearing what other folks think as opposed to my own thoughts. But I think one of the things for me that's really animating my entry and understanding of trans studies is the question, and I think I indeed mean it as a question, but the question of materiality. What does it mean to be a certain kind of body, and how do we assess and think about what it means to be certain kinds of, in particular, gendered subjects? And for me, that's rendered as a question because it seems to me that the very notion of materiality, the very notion of embodiment, by way of trans studies and by way of trans as an analytic is being thrown into a kind of crisis or questioning. So how then can we think about reconfiguring, reimagining, maybe even abolishing various tenets on which the body rests? And that to me is incredibly exciting, also incredibly terrifying too, precisely because if one of the things that situates us in time and space, situates us in relation to other people, is the purported facticity of the body. To throw that into question is then to throw into question our very status as subjects in relation to other people. But I do think genuinely that throwing into crisis implies or looks toward a different modality of being and relating to one another on grounds that are not constituted by the normative, constituted by violence, constituted by all these various kind of hegemonic identities that are imposed upon us. So how can we then think about materiality and subjectivity, embodiment, et cetera, otherwise? So that's the question that's really animating trans studies for me right now, among other questions, of course, but for me, it's that question of materiality.
Great, thank you,
Hi,
Aaron.
folks. Okay, I guess I'm next. So thank you for starting us off, Marquis. I'm taking quite a long view in trying to answer this question. And so I think back to when I started working in what I would now consider transgender studies. And that was really in the early 1980s. And so when I look at the field today, I'm looking at a long view. And at that time, there were few words. I had to explain to people what I was talking about. The word transgender was not in common use yet. The word non-binary had not been conceived of. We had really two words, transsexual and transvestite, both of which today are considered kind of, you don't want to call people that unless they tell you to. There was very little activism happening. There was some, but it was very little. It was very isolated. There were very few organizations. There was really almost no intersectional awareness, which is something that animates the field totally today. There was no internet. And so that meant that it's hard today to understand how isolated people were back then. And that includes academics. All the experts were cisgender people. There was no expertise given or recognized among trans people. And remarkably, you could read pretty much everything that had been written on the subject, because there was so little that had been written by cisgender people. It was basically all medicalized, and it was basically all pathologizing. All right, so that's kind of where I'm starting my view from. And when I look at where we're at today, I find it very exciting. People are not isolated the way they were before. We're starting to see academics throughout universities and intellectuals addressing themselves to trans questions from many different directions. But it's still, to my view, very much token positions. It's very hard to find anywhere that there's more than one person doing this kind of work in any particular department. And it's even unusual to find more than a very small handful of people doing this work in an entire university. There's no departments that I'm aware of transgender studies as yet. There's no degrees given anywhere that I'm aware of in the world in transgender studies as yet. I had the first chair in transgender studies, but it's a research chair. It's not a chair of a department. And now there's a second one. Not everybody knows about it, but there is a chair at the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. And I'm very pleased. We just had a conference, Moving Trans History Forward conference, and one of our keynote speakers was Blas Radi, who is one of the coordinators, one of the two people that hold that chair. The other is Mauro Cabral. And he said some, I thought, very interesting things in his speech. So I'm going to reference him now. I'm going to quote him, in fact. So one of the things he said was, working as academics, on the one hand, we want institutions to be welcoming for trans people, and we have the necessary skills to take on the task of institutional improvement. But on the other hand, although it is a job that is both specialized and exhausting, it is generally unpaid and unrecognized. I really felt like that summed up nicely what a lot of us are doing who are doing transgender work and transgender studies. And we work ourselves hard. We get almost no recognition in our home disciplines because there are no departments of trans studies. We're all in some disciplinary field, and hardly ever does our work get the kind of recognition that it deserves in those disciplines. It's marginalized. We have to try twice as hard. We have to make the case that it really is real scholarship. And I know this is not universal for everybody, but this is the trends that I see as the state of the field. I'm going to quote Blas again, because he said something very nice about that as well. So here we are. There's a few of us. We're scattered around. It's hard to keep track of who else is doing it, and hard to build those alliances. Blas says, people who don't just walk through the door, but hold it open for others who might not otherwise get through, take longer to make their journeys. Right? So I'm a full professor. I've got all of that behind me, but most of the people doing this work are just starting out. And so all of this work of changing the institution, of asking for and demanding that our work is recognized as valid work, makes it take longer for people to get through. And so I think that's something we need to recognize about the state of the field as well. So what's animating the field now that I'm excited about? I see racial justice has come to the forefront of the field. I'm very excited about that. I'm working in Canada. In Canada, a lot of that is focused on Indigenous reconciliation, and that's very central to the work being done in Canada. But other intersectionalities are being paid attention to. I'm very happy to see that. In addition to racial justice, disability, immigration, and many other kinds of intersectionality. So for me, that's an exciting part. I see both an enforcement and a resistance to transnormativity happening in the field. And I'm interested to see how that plays out in the long term. And then finally, I want to mention things that I'm excited about seeing is more and more attention to the issues of non-binary people and the realities of non-binary people, and more attention to trans children or gender diverse children, to be more precise. Okay, I'm used my 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Julian, do you mind going next?
Great. Hi, everybody, again. Thanks for the invitation to be here. What an exciting and necessary conversation. Oh, goodness. Where might I start? I'm actually kind of glad to be going third, because I think when thinking about materiality, and also, as Erin was just saying about racial justice, thinking about those two things to answer the question, what is the current state of trans studies, I really see ongoing kinds of contestations around what I have called the limits of recognition, which for me includes acknowledging the limits of representation. And I think that addresses a bit this kind of contestation between those who are invested in transnormativity as a strategy, but also provides room to think about those who are not and what can be learned from those who are not interested or invested in that. I happen to really believe that, racial justice does require the destruction of the investment in gender, especially if we're going to be thinking about Black bodies or Black people, period. So that's really where I'm at in thinking about it. I also am really excited to see what I feel like is a turn away from investigating notions of identity amongst queer, trans, and non-binary people toward a more capacious kind of understanding, if you will, of embodiment, which for me allows much more room to think about change over time with regard to the way that many of our embodiments really do change and shift. And it is precisely the kinds of cages, okay, that identity and identity politics really impress upon us that really constrain much more, in my experience, than they free, especially when thinking about Black folk. So I'm wondering about a turn in the field toward thinking about not necessarily duality, but multiplicity rather, and how we might hold together what have been named as contradictory kinds of experiences, embodiments, and not hold these together without also seeking or being so obsessed, if you will, with seeking recognition from the state and all of its institutional kinds of powers. Okay, so that's really where I'm at in thinking about the state of the field. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Chris, do you mind going next?
Sure, thanks so much. Although my mind is now going in a million different directions. So I join you all today from the land of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples, now called Michigan in the United States. I am an education researcher, so I am sort of a little more applied, perhaps, in some ways than some of my colleagues who are working the edges of theory, which is so important for my thinking and also to bring to education research. But I think when I look at the trajectories of literature on various social identities in education, trans identities being one, I see a pattern that looks something like this. We sort of begin a field with some sort of visibility or establishment studies, like quote unquote, discovering that, oh, these people are here with us. We sort of point to a population that hasn't been acknowledged. Then we get some maybe personal narratives. People talk about their experiences as trans people, non-binary people, in my case, in education. Then some maybe exploratory empirical studies begin, beginning to sketch the contours of the experiences and identities. And then we begin to see kind of an expansion of research on identities, experiences, maybe some causal and descriptive studies. So I sort of see an arc, and this has happened for African-American students, it's happened for students of different racial and ethnic groups, low-income students, first-gen students, gay and lesbian students, then queer students, and now sort of trans. So there's kind of this trajectory in general for students and faculty, staff, teachers in public schools, kind of across identities. So I see it's not purely linear. We continue to have sort of visibility and narratives as we begin other types of studies. But the really exciting thing for me as an education researcher is that we're at the point where we've got a really full array of these kinds of studies happening. And they're being generated with, by, and for through participatory work, autoethnographic work, trans and non-binary people, as well as those of us who ally ourselves in that way. So I think it's really exciting to me to see in general that these kinds of studies are spanning across these new types of visibility. We're looking across the lifespan and how that intersects with education. So that's pretty exciting to me. I'm also, thinking of materiality, just because I traffic in a world of trying to create education policy and influence practice, I also think about how we do things like collect data that might include gender identities in them, and the ways that we do harm to people when we don't collect data, or when we attempt to collect data in ways that are violent or erase people. So I am working in some ways to think about what some people will call a queer quantitative or critical quantitative approach to thinking about how we do this work, recognizing that just the doing of statistical research can create different kinds of harm and reify kind of categories. So kind of balancing that razor edge of how do we get the data we need to show that students are thriving in some ways, or teachers are thriving or not. It's really important work because that does help us affect policy. So that to me is a place that people are beginning to do. I can name a couple early career scholars, Carrie Dockendorf, who is at Colorado State University. They are doing amazing work on trans-informed critical quantitative research surveys. They're actually the person who convinced me it was possible to do critical quantitative work. So hats off to Carrie, Dr. Dockendorf, and then Dr. Alex Lenge, who just defended at Iowa, has developed a really interesting model of trans identity development, non-binary identity development that involves some new ways of thinking about identity processes. So there's some really cool kind of, I think, path-breaking work happening in those ways. I'm actually going to stop right there because I want to get back to some other ideas after.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you. So Travers, do you mind going last here?
I do not mind. Let me just set my own timer. Okay, well, it's a tremendous honor to be with this group and, to be considered an expert. I have a little bit of an imposter syndrome because trans studies is such an incredible field, but I'm going to speak about my own scholarship. The areas I focus on. I focus on two overlapping areas: transgender children and policies and experiences of trans and non-binary people of all ages in sport and physical recreation. Right now, trans kids' access to respect, support, and healthcare, and the participation of trans feminine people in girls and women's sports is being hotly contested by a constellation of interest groups with an investment in conservative heteropatriarchal gender politics, many of whom are also into white power nationalism. The maintenance of Eurocentric heteropatriarchal sex systems and gender relations is equated with white supremacist and colonial notions of civilization. So all my work recognizes the way in which our sex and gender systems are embedded in larger systems of oppression. Scholarship that locates trans kids within interlocking systems of power is indebted to Black feminism and queer and trans scholars of color. Instead of identifying scholarship from 2021, because I'm not aware of anything that's blown my mind around trans kids in 2021, I'm going to maintain that the 3 books on trans kids that came out in 2018, and here's where my imposter syndrome isn't so strong because I wrote one of them, although they are distinct in their foci, they collectively set a high bar for the subfield of transgender children within trans studies. All 3 engage with and make important contributions to critical trans scholarship. The first is Histories of the Transgender Child by Jules Gill Peterson, a field-defining book if I've ever read one. Trans Kids Being Gendered in the 21st Century by Tay Meadow, and my own, The Trans Generation, How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution. I see almost every piece now on transgender children that people want to publish. And if it isn't, incorporating a critical race perspective, I block it. And I think that, that's a really important way to make that intervention. With regard to scholarship on transgender inclusion in sport, there's incredible tension around transnormativity versus anti-oppression scholarship and strategies, and incredible tensions, because we see female eligibility policies that disproportionately target gender nonconforming women of color and transgender women for surveillance and discipline. These policies have immediate discriminatory implications that have been subject to scholarly examination, but many of the articles that cross my desk for review fail to understand the historical and contemporary role of sport in maintaining and promoting various forms of oppression, as well as offering an opportunity for resistance. Similarly, the public discourse about these policies rarely ever examines the sex segregation of sport as a white supremacist, colonial, and heteropatriarchal project. The attacks on trans feminine participation in girls and women's sport in the United Kingdom and the USA are a chilling backdrop for scholars who are analyzing transgender participation in sport and trying to critically locate it within an understanding of modern sport as a civilizing and heteropatriarchal project. Scholarship to date is focused on identifying the inadequacies of current policies for transgender inclusion at professional, elite, amateur, and recreational levels. And this scholarship is sort of pushing to imagine ways to make sport more inclusive and more anti-oppressive or less oppressive. But the problem is that we are encountering these really powerful attacks on the participation of trans feminine people in sport. And that relates to, my subsequent concerns. How do we continue to push forward our critical analysis while at the same time combating like really dangerous social movements?
Great, thank you. Thank you all so much for your thoughts. I learned a lot from hearing all of your comments, and I'm looking forward to our continued conversation. Before I ask the next question for folks in the audience, please feel free to submit your questions as our panelists are speaking. After this next round, I'm going to ask one more question. Our panelists are going to speak one more time, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A from the audience. So please feel free to get your question in the queue so we can hear your questions collectively after this next round of questions. Just one more question for me, and that's about sort of the future of the field. So where do you think trans studies needs to go next? What questions do you think are have not yet been fully explored or addressed as of yet in the field? And Marquis, would you mind going first again?
And try. I'm really prepared an answer for this. Where trans studies can go next? I think this was mentioned a bit already, but I do think one of the directions that trans studies is beginning to go and could continue to go in is thinking about non-binariness. And by that, I want to understand that at least not only through my own non-binariness, but in other people and other modes of thinking that I've encountered, thinking about non-binariness, not as a particular possessed, defined, and delimited identity per se, but a relation to what gender might mean, what gender is, how gender could be undermined, subverted, reconfigured, etc. I'm interested in, because there's not a lot of literature out there, so I'm interested in how non-binariness might then emerge as a mode of gendered critique that could be generative, I think. And the work of C. Riley Snorton, his newest work on like Black ecological life is speaking to that a bit. And so that's something I think I'm quite interested in a direction, a worthy direction for trans studies to go in. And I think also perhaps thinking about the question, or maybe even, this is just me thinking off the top of my head now, a return to or a reinvigorated critique of the question of sex, perhaps, especially in the context of kind of backlashes via the right with respect to bathrooms, et cetera. How might we return to the question of sex in a way that is genuinely, thoroughly critical, let's say, reinvigorating something like the work of Judith Butler, Embody That Matter, and Butler's deeply, deeply incisive critique of sex itself, and in the way that it's absorbed within gender, in the ways that it is, as Butler said, a fiction or a phantasm. How can we return to that as a mode of mobilizing what we're trying to do in our theorizing and radical theorizing with respect to trans studies? So yeah, those I think are directions that we might go in. There might be others, of course, but those are the things that come most immediately to mind.
Thank you, thank you. Aaron?
Okay, thank you. So things have changed, as I said before, and with those changes come new circumstances for us to work within. And so one of the things that I see happening today is that we have pretty easy access to each other's work because, you know, everything's up on the internet and we have search engines and it's not hard to find it. And there's tons of it being pumped out there. And that's exciting. And I think that's great. I'm very excited about that. One of the things that comes out of that for me is I see a danger of those of us who work in this area becoming enmeshed in a kind of intellectual echo chamber where there's so much for us to look at, there's so much for us to think about, there's so many others to talk with that we can just talk with each other. We can get very easily engaged in excessive academies and jargon because we talk to each other and we know that language. And most of the work that I see happening, that's part of what I see being recognized as trans studies is work in the social sciences and humanities broadly cast. There has been for a long time, and there still is a lot of work being done in coming from the medical field, coming from counselors. And I don't feel like we're paying enough attention to the practitioners who are out there trying to be helpful. And I'm not claiming they are being helpful. In some cases they are, some cases they're not. But I think we need to pay attention to them, right? And we need to be careful to not get stuck in that echo chamber talking to each other. Now, within that echo chamber, part of what I see happening that concerns me, that I'm asking people whenever I have the opportunity to pay attention to, is I see a lot of posturing and a lot of calling out of each other. And what I think we need to do more of is calling in. We need to remember that we are a tiny minority, and by we, I mean trans folks writ large, the most expansive definition you could come up with for that. We're still the tiny minority. And if we're looking at trans academics, we're even smaller, tiny minority. And we need to, when we see people saying and doing things that we don't agree with, rather than posture and calling them out, we need to call them in. We need to say, let's work together. Let's figure out our differences. Let's build on those. And I think we need to pay more attention to speaking accessibly among ourselves, but also to the public. And by the public, I mean the trans plus public and also the cisgender public. Again, I come back to, we are a tiny minority. If we want to change the world, we need lots and lots and lots of allies, right? And part of what we need to do in order to reach that is to build more alliances, more coalitions across all those intersectionalities, and bring in people from everywhere who are interested in being with us and working with us. So I'm looking at trans academics or transgender studies as a way of being activists, but I'm asking us to not be activists just inside of our bubble, just inside of our echo chamber. Again, I'm going to quote from Blas, my other chair in transgender studies. So in his keynote address a couple of weeks ago, one of the things he said was, in some ways being trans and existing is also a political act, with which it makes sense to say that in a certain way, all trans people are trans activists. Now, I agree with him, and that includes people who work in transgender studies, but it's not enough. All right, we need to reach out. We need to build those coalitions. We need to talk to the public, and we need to talk to allies, and we need to call people in, not call people out. So, what are the debates that I see for the future that I'm excited about? Well, you can probably tell by me referencing Blas over and over again. A North-South dialogue. We need to do more of that. An East-West dialogue. There's lots going on in Asia that people in North America are not paying attention to. All right, so get out of that bubble once again. Marquis, I'm very interested in the future of non-binary. This is something that is dear to my heart. The very first publication I ever made that I count as transgender studies, which was way back in 1987, was called this was an article, Gender Blending When Two Is Not Enough. And then I followed that with a book called Gender Blending, Confronting the Limits of Duality. All right, so I have been thinking about this for a long time, and I am very excited about where I see us going with non-binary. All right. And I mentioned already before, I think we need to be looking more at the limits of transnormativity. So that's another thing that kind of goes together with the non-binary. Last thing I want to mention, because I'm just about out of time again, is that one of the things that I'm arguing for and that I see as coming in the future is I think that gender will become, needs to become, should become, and will become private information that is protected under privacy laws. And when you stop to think about the ramifications for how society is structured, if gender is not public information, it is deeply profound. And it comes back to, okay, what is gender? What is sex? What is all of that going to look like if all of that information is private? I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, thank you. Julian, do you mind going next?
Yeah, of course. I think trans studies needs to sit with a few things a bit more. One, as Marquis already has mentioned, is a materiality, but I want to invite everybody to think together materiality, methodology, as Chris was talking about, and also world-making practices. I don't know about you all, but you know, the trans people who I'm in community with, you know, continue to develop all kinds of lived practices, right? That allow us the kind of space to, you know, invest in ourselves, you know, in a world that remains hell-bent on our annihilation rather than seeking recognition from institutions. And of course, I don't want my comments to come up and say, I'm not, you know, it's not important at all. It is to think about, you know, institutionality and one's relationship to it. But I also think that it does not, it often does not leave us the room to think alongside institutionality, to think about other kinds of world-making practices that have little or anything to do with being recognized or affirmed by an institution. So I think that that's definitely a place that I would love to see more work within trans studies. And again, I think, as I was saying earlier, multiplicity feels like a very ripe way of engaging this. And, you know, this is to say, there are already several Black artists, of course, who are engaging this conceptions of multiplicity as we speak. Of course, the people that come to my mind are Moses Sumney, you know, in particular. So I think that they do offer us a way to think about world-making practices, like I was saying, in advance or like in excess, if you will, of what we have already. Also, can we think about what it means to, oh goodness, to think about critical non-monogamy as a world-making practice that really helps us understand and undo the kind of pernicious influence that I think whiteness as property, following, you know, the work of Cheryl Harris, has really robbed us of the space, the time to develop a particular kind of relational ethic, okay, by which we think very differently about, you know, difference. So I'm really thinking here with, you know, folks like Audre Lorde to think about the practices that specifically Black, queer, trans, and non-binary folks already are engaging, you know, that are very much world-making practices that lead us to conjure, that enable us to conjure Black futures, because I do believe they must be conjured. Now, let me just say this in closing with this portion. I also think that on the topic of Blackness, I will also say that everybody in trans studies needs to deal with their relationship to Blackness, not just the Black folk. That's what feels very, very important, because it's to say that whether you are Black or not, we all have a particular kind of relationship. And I think that there are so many of us who don't necessarily think about our specific relationship to Blackness, who are not Black, okay? And therefore aren't able to think about the kind of things that, you know, we might need to adjust, the kind of practices okay, that we should be adjusting if we are truly, committed to engaging in particular kinds of freedom practices. This is something that, of course, I think, Black folks cannot necessarily get away from, but it is work that everybody must commit to doing, not just the folks who are most affected.
Yeah, thank you so much. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Julian and Aaron and Marquis. So I'm thinking about, also there's a question that in the comments from a person who says, as a trans high schooler who's become involved in trans studies, I'm wondering how you all have thoughts on how trans studies can be made more available to a wider audience. It took me a while to build up a basis to understand the theory. So first, shout out to you, Naomi, for taking this up in your AP research class. I think when I was in high school, I was, I don't know, conjugating nouns or verbs or something, but good on you. And I'm thinking about this world making question and bringing in questions about anti-Black racism in world making and what it means, again, particularly in sort of the applied area of education research. What if we took seriously in this sort of maybe a new wave or a new way of thinking about trans studies, sort of the radical inclusion across age, and using and centering the ideas and voices and values of trans youth and non-binary youth in the generation of our ideas and making our ideas more accessible, more able to be used by sort of folks across the age groups. So I'm thinking about kind of opening up what we think of as trans studies to be a little less locked in the academy. I know many people on this call, and I'm guessing many in the audience, are the participants also do work across a range of ways, but it is, now that we have made trans studies a thing you can do in some parts of the academy, I don't want it to get trapped here. I want it to be sort of set free in some ways, and thinking about how do we do that and how do we take these kinds of new ideas that we can talk to the voters in Arkansas who are electing the people who are actively harming trans youth, right? So, well, lots of people, not just Arkansas, but this week, right? So thinking about what would it mean to have trans studies? Can we make this more accessible? How do we center non-academics in this conversation? Using the privilege we have as academics. I mean, many years ago, Celia Kitzinger, a white lesbian researcher, said, as a lesbian in society, more or less, I'm oppressed, but in the academy, as a lesbian of the academy, I'm quite privileged compared to other lesbians. Terrible paraphrase. But that idea that even though we're doing a lot of labor and many trans folks are in very precarious positions as academics, people doing trans studies are in precarious positions, we still are in some positions in some institutions that have some power and have some obligation and some duty to think about how we make our work more accessible and more inclusive. So that's kind of where I'm thinking about kind of a next space for it. And Naomi, I invite you right along to be one of our folks in that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Naomi's question. I'd love to hear folks across the panel address her question in a minute, but first let's get to Travers.
Thank you. There are two interrelated issues that concern me most about trans studies. The first is the field is hampered by the relations of production that characterize the academy. Specifically this means the disproportionate inclusion of trans scholars who are white, economically privileged, masculine, abled, and from the global north, like me. The second is that attacks on trans people in the United Kingdom and the USA that are being advanced, sorry, I just ran up, that are being advanced are so chilling and damaging that it's really easy for us to use my sports metaphor, play defense, to fight for the unjust systems that currently exist, because those unjust systems are under attack by things that would make it much worse. But it's, I suppose it's the real tension that, exists in, the contemporary political moment too. The need for harm reduction while fighting to change unjust institutions. But how do we, when we are fighting for harm reduction, not further entrench the unjust institutions and practices that are already so harmful to so many? And that's the question that I have. And I think it's the question that we need to be answering. And I don't have the answer to it. But one of the things that I think characterizes trans studies as a particularly powerful place to engage with these questions is because it has been so foundationally influenced by Black feminism, by post-colonial thinking, by scholars of color, queer and trans and women of color, like, and also the clear connections with critical disability scholarship and trans studies. And I think this is a strength of the area, not in all aspects. You know, there are clusters here and there, but for me, that is what makes trans studies something that's so worth fighting for. But we have to be very explicit about the way in which we recruit graduate students from undergrads, the way that we support graduate students, and the way that we support junior faculty. Like, how do we make sure that the minoritized faculties or faculty members within our institutions succeed? Like, we have to throw our weight behind them. And, you know, and I'm speaking here as a full professor. Like, I consider it one of my main tasks at this stage of my career to support more vulnerable scholars. And, you know, for me, this is very clearly, you know, scholars of color, trans scholars, et cetera, who are particularly vulnerable. And I think that I would like to see trans studies like maintain this focus on, you know, systems of oppression as interlocking and shaping trans experience, and focusing on the striations, the inequalities within trans communities, within trans studies, within social movements, et cetera, so that we don't end up with the, you know, the endless defensive maneuvering that keeps those of us who are most privileged able to buy houses in ridiculous markets. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for your brilliant comments so far. And at this point, we're going to transition to taking questions from the audience. We have a bunch of really great questions in the Q&A submitted already, and I look forward to hearing from as many folks as we can fit in the rest of our time together. So Chris pointed out a really great question that was submitted from Naomi, a trans high schooler. I'd love to have the rest of the panel have a chance to interact with this question. I'll read it here. As a trans high schooler who has become involved in trans studies in my AP research class, I was wondering if you all had thoughts on how trans studies can be made accessible to a wider audience, as it took me a really long time to build up enough of a basis to be able to understand trans theory. And at this point, you know, we don't have to be as formal going through the list, so anyone can chime in. Just unmute yourself and speak to Naomi's question. Yeah, Aaron, go ahead. Oh, you're unmuted.
Well, yeah, I was just getting ready. I didn't think I was gonna be the first one. Okay. So as soon as you called on me, I'll go ahead. So I think the first thing that I would like to see, and I think I said this in my remarks a little bit already, is that we use plain English. Right? We avoid jargon. We avoid those multi-syllabic ways of saying things that make it less accessible for people who are not part of our highly educated, many degrees kind of way of life. And I also firmly believe that if you can't say it in plain English, you probably don't really understand what you're talking about. Right. So, you know, I mentioned before, we just had a conference. I put on these conferences every 2 years with a small and mighty team of people. And when we advertise for the conferences, I always insist that it says the language of the conference is plain English. And if people send us an abstract or proposal that's not in plain English, I send it back to them. I say, write it in plain English. And if they can't do that, they don't get to talk at these conferences, because I think it's essential that Naomi and people like Naomi of all ages who are not part of this world can be part of the conversation. So very simple answer. Took too many words for me to say it, but they were all in plain English.
Thank you, Aaron. Anyone else want to chime into this question?
I think it relates to paying attention to who gets to construct the field again, because I mean, I think about Bell Hooks, and Patricia Williams and Patricia Hill Collins and Audre Lorde, and their insistence on writing powerfully and speaking powerfully in a way that could be widely understood. Beautiful, powerful writers who introduced incredibly complex ideas. And I think that the elitism of the academy is like a deep problem. And I do believe that if we, try to counter that by recruiting a wider body of scholars and, thinking about relating with people in the community as a key aspect of our work, that we can do that. But there's so much precedent. There's so much wonderful work that exists.
And can I just continue, Travis, what you were just saying? I think it's so important that I think a part of what the work that you're asking us to do, what it requires is continually shifting, like what we recognize as knowledge, shifting, the nature of knowledge here, there. So I think that there's a way that, there are people who I know whose work already attempts to do this. I think even my own kind of like what my dissertation was dealing with, the kind of theoretical contribution that it made was something that I didn't quite expect, but it made so much sense. And that is embodied knowledge, understood to be the harnessing of lived experiences of racial, gender, sexual, and class subjugation, which are harnessed and transformed into strategies, tactics, and tools that multiply marginalized people use, right, to acquire the human and material resources, we're back to materiality here again, needed to survive in a world that remains hell-bent on our annihilation, right? So by engaging the breadth and depth of embodied knowledge, we are very much shifting the very nature of epistemology. You see what I'm saying? And I think that that is one possible way to do that. And I really appreciate what Aaron is saying about plain English as well. I mean, I hope that it's clear thus far, of course I've got all these degrees and whatnot, but if my girlfriends can't understand what it is that I'm saying, then I need to go back to the drawing board and figure out how I can say it. You see what I'm saying? Because again, it really is just that important to me to make sure that people are being able to understand, not just that, but also to engage, the work of folks, and I was answering this in one of the questions, engage the work of people who are not understood to be academics. In fact, seriously and rigorously engaging, you see what I'm saying, the work of creatives, Black creatives in particular, who are all the time giving us glimpses and visions of the future, but we have to humble ourselves enough to recognize and listen to that brilliance, so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. All right, well, we can move on to another question. So Professor in the Q&A asks, how can trans studies inform and interact with grassroots queer activism, particularly queer activism that is looking beyond assimilation and towards liberation?
I'll take a start. I'm thinking actually back to some of the answers to the previous couple of questions. I'm thinking about moving us away from materiality, moving us away from only speaking in fancy language. So thinking about how we get out of our own way, maybe as academics. There are a set of things you need to do, and all of us are, I've talked sometimes about how higher education universities are the place where a lot of formal, quote unquote, trans studies is conducted. People who are graduate students, undergraduates, faculty people, other kinds of researchers. We do it at the academy. The academy is one of the least queer places on the planet. Like, it is super hierarchical and masculinized and self-reproduces, and it does all the things, right? So we have to get out of our way of that and thinking, well, for some of us, we were like, well, let me just get in the way of that enough to like become a full professor so I can then hold the door open, as Aaron says, for some other people. But how do I not lose my soul? And how do I not lose sight of grassroots? The change I'm trying to make for the people I'm trying to make the change for isn't for the people who are making their way up necessarily through this particular rank, right? So how do I think about connecting and doing, community-based research, community-engaged research that starts with the questions that the community is interested in, and not with the questions I bring to them. Like, hey, I got a grant to do a project. I'm going to come do a project on you, is one approach, a more traditional approach. But what starts with, I'm engaged in a community organization, and I want to bring that work forward, answering those questions. So I think for some of us who work in more applied fields like education, maybe social work, we might be able to start in the communities instead of starting in when we went to our office buildings. That might be one way to think about it, sort of the more engaged, ground up research.
I'll take a crack at that too. So I made a few notes, and the first thing I would say is that it's our job to learn from community activists. So that in terms of engaging, that's the first thing I would do. I see over and over again academics putting out publications and claiming great new breakthroughs about things that have been talked about in the community for years and are well understood in the community. And so if we're going to learn from the community, we should also give them the credit for that. This is where we learned it from. This is who has been teaching us, and amplify their voices and their accomplishments and what we have learned from activist communities, people who are on the ground. They also, Chris, I would agree with you, people in the community need research done. If activists are out there trying to make the case, trying to make things happen, what influences the policymakers, the people that they're trying to influence, the legislators who are passing these awful bills? Well, data influences them. And so we need to learn, we need to communicate, we need to collaborate, as Chris was saying, with community groups. What is the research they need done? We're getting paid to do research, produce the data they need, give it to them so they can do the work. And we have a voice that a lot of community activists don't have. I, for one, I'm sure other people on this panel, I speak to the media all the time. So I have the opportunity to bring those messages forward that some of the people who are on the ground doing the activist work don't have the opportunity. But it's important to always, give people credit for the work that they're doing.
Yeah,
If
absolutely.
I can tie the issue of access and relevance to the community together, I think that if we understand our work to be telling stories, it's really helpful because people respond to stories, and you can also tell stories with quantitative data. I remember, what was it, Becky Pettit's book, Invisible Lives, where she discovered that US data about declining racial inequality, economic inequality, was actually based on the fact that all the, mostly people of color in prison, they weren't being counted. Like telling stories with data. If we understand that to be our role, then we, if we're engaging with communities, we learn from them. What stories is it important to tell, and how should we tell them? But I really think that if we're doing our work well, that is what we do. We tell stories that won't otherwise be told in a way that is transformative, if we're lucky.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we have so many, just in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward to the next question. We have so many great questions coming in. So next question is from Robin Oakes, who first says hi, and then asks, I'm interested in the intersection or relationship between our developing understandings of non-binary genders and non-binary sexualities, and of non-binariness in general, in academic thought and also out in the world. I now use the phrase identities between and or beyond the binaries, and a word Marquis just used, non-binariness.
Well, I guess because I was named, I can speak to this a bit. For me, I think it's an invitation to think about the very fundamental question of how that which exists is kind of constructed along the lines of certain kinds of logics, by which I mean like literally like what are the things, the structures, the kind of ligaments that allow for something to be understood as existing as such. So it's, for me, non-binariness is a fundamental interrogation of the very terms and conditions that cultivate what is legible, what exists, what is real, etc. So it then invites us to think about ways to move and be and think and exist outside of that, precisely because it then engenders an understanding of the logic that we have as fundamentally deeply constricting. So there's this presumption by way of kind of mainstream systems and things like that via the state, that what we have is what there is. So non-binariness is a way to opt out of that logic in favor of something else that might exist, something else that might be, something else that might be possible. And I think too, that very move is the thing that is what I want to emphasize, like the very move to get outside of these things that we understand as natural, et cetera, because to presume them to be natural disallows us to even think about the possibility of there being an outside. So that non-binariness posits the possibility of something other than this is the thing that I want to emphasize. And that's, to me, where trans studies and non-binariness intersect or interrelate in their denaturalizing of things that are presumed to be natural. And then in their denaturalizing, how can we then imagine other things, imagine other possibilities for life and livability? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to this question? Yeah, Aaron, please go ahead.
So just picking up on what Marquis was saying, we live very much in a binary world still, although that's starting to loosen up. And I think probably most of the people that are with us today would agree if I say that that is something that is imposed upon us by the social system that we live in. And, so trying to imagine, well, what would it be like if we were not having that binary gender demanded of us at all times? Because we are resisting it, but it is demanded of us in many, many very thoroughgoing ways. And it's my opinion that our gender expression would be our natural, if I'll use the word that Marquis was using, that if we went back to nature and we're not socially imposing gender, that it would be like everything else in nature. And the distribution of almost everything in nature is what's commonly called a bell curve, or normal distribution for those of you who know stats. All right. So that bell curve is almost everything's in the middle, and there's a little bit out at the extremes. So right now we have this binary distribution. We've got two lumps if we put it on a graph. And I think that's imposed upon us. And I think if we could get out from under that imposition, and I think we're moving in that direction, that what we will see is that center of the curve will fill up, and that the vast majority of people are somewhere in that non-binary distribution, and that there will still be some people who are very binary, that's their nature, if you will. But I think that left to a natural development that was not quite so structured by social demands, non-binary is where most of us would go.
Great. Thank you for your thoughts there. Any other thoughts on this question?
I would like for children to be assumed non-binary until they tell us different. In which case, whatever they tell us, we immediately proceed, and that they can change that this can change. I think that would be, an ideal situation for kids.
Yeah. So let's, just in the interest of time, I'm going to move us forward to the next question. A question submitted by Atticus, who asks to any panelists, what role do you see intersex scholarship playing in the movement for trans and bodily liberation? Do you see patterns in gender and sex critiques being put in conversation with one another? If not, why?
I can go really quick with this. So I think this was mentioned in the chat like 20 minutes ago. The first thing I'd say is go read Hill Malatino's work, specifically, I guess both of their books, Trans Care, which just came out, I think last year, late last year. It's a very short book, as well as Queer Embodiments, which came out, I think, in 2019. Both absolutely phenomenal. So I suggest one to go to. I'll defer to Hill on that, but also just really quickly. For me, I think intersex studies is a way to, or is an avenue into really denaturalizing and interrogating sex as a discourse and as an apparatus or framework, because there's so often, even sometimes in some pockets of trans studies, and also, of course, in the larger mainstream, the assumption of the distinction between sex and gender, and then the presumption that sex is this kind of natural, immutable thing or unchangeable thing, and that it's kind of transparent and unmediated. What intersex study does is really show that like these things too are deeply embedded in social biases, in the ways that we understand gender, and in the ways that we expect certain kind of trajectories for people assigned certain sexes, and then how that then bears on their livelihood and livability and feelings about themselves and one another. And so it's an interrogation of like what even sex is and how we come to understand that, how we come to define that, and the various kinds of biases, standards, criteria, et cetera, that are ultimately arbitrary, that go into that as well, which again allows us to denaturalize sex in, I think, really beneficial and generative ways.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Anyone else have thoughts on this question? We can move on. We have another really interesting question. This one from Anna Christina, who asks, the intersection of trans and aging remains understudied and perhaps even more importantly, absent from policy making. How do you relate the work you conduct with the topic of aging trans people and ageism in both academia and activism? They also say, thanks for this webinar, wonderful food for thought. Any thoughts on the connection between trans and aging, either in your work or in policymaking or academia in general?
Okay.
Maybe that silence. Oh, sorry. I was going to say maybe that silence is the fact that it is an indication that it is understudied, right? Under discussed. But Aaron, please go ahead.
Well, I thought as the old guy on the panel, I should start in on this one. Okay, so I would agree it is very understudied. There's not much attention given to it. We are starting to see, I've been working on some projects and I'm in coordination with people working on projects in a number of different places to do oral history with elders of the community. I always bring out, have an elders panel in my conference. So I'm trying to bring a little more attention to the older folks in the community, the elders of our community. I think there's a lot to learn from them. But in terms of actual study beyond recording their stories, which, as I say, is happening in several places, I don't see much done. One of the jobs that I do is I work on the standards of care from the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, which are guidelines for medical care people who want trans people who want to engage with the medical community, medical institutions, and they don't have anything in there about aging. Right? They've got lots about children and teenagers and people of their mid-years, but there's a completely silent, and it's not like they haven't been asked to put material in there about it. So, you know, there's no attention there. There's very little attention in care homes in terms of training people in care homes. And there's huge concern among elders about what's going to happen when I need to go into care. Some have gone into care already, but you know, not that many of us have reached that age yet. And huge concerns about going back into the closet, being mistreated, being abused. It's a big question that is in front of people about aging, and we know almost nothing. There is some work being done, but it's very little. And so I would say, when we're asking about where do we want to see the field going, that's one area that I really think we should go in. And two parts to it. One is learning from our elders before we lose them, and making sure that we care for our elders properly. And we can't do that without doing some study to find out, well, what do they need?
Yeah, thank you, Erin. Thank you, Erin. Anyone else want to weigh in on this? Yeah, Travis, go ahead.
I think Erin touched on this earlier, and I think it's really important. It's a challenge, certainly for the subfield of transgender children that I'm keenly interested in, but for trans studies more broadly, to incorporate contributions about gender, sex, sexuality from the global north or from minoritized populations within the global north in a way that doesn't fetishize them and, try to appropriate, but like literally to create the space. Because one of the things that I think is really important is that this whole Eurocentric binary sex and gender system with, heteropatriarchal monogamy, white supremacy, colonialism, all of it, this whole notion of civilization, like it's very purposefully eclipsed so many other ways of being and seeing. And I would like to see us make the, the sort of the dominant view smaller and smaller and smaller and create more space. But, there's certainly a history I know of, white academics appropriating and fetishizing from other cultures. So that's not what I'm hoping for, obviously, but I do think that this decentering of the Eurocentric worldview is something I would really like to see more of in trans studies.
Great. Yeah. Other thoughts? Well, there's a lot of questions in the chat about activism and the connection between the work that we're doing in the academy, writing, with largely academic audiences, and activism. And so I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about that collectively. There's another question in the chat, or in the Q&A, that asks, could you folks speak to how we might better leverage our positions, our research within academia to have more of an impact on the ground or in the public sphere?
Yeah, I can jump in here and say I love this question. I think it's a really important kind of question. And I guess this is a question I'm wrestling with all the time. And what I've had to come to accept before I can answer the question and do the work is to accept that given my relationship to the institution, there will always be a limit to how the work might be received. There will always be. It is to say that everything that I'm doing will never quite be enough to fully address the constantly changing context and needs for people in my community. And I still choose to do the work. I do think that it does require us to engage in some, what we might call insurgent or fugitive kind of practices here. So I'll just give an example. I've at my university, they asked me to plan a symposium or plan a conference. And I used all the funds to invite exclusively Black and Brown, queer, trans, and non-binary artists, a couple of scholars, but really just a couple, and just creative folks whose work has a lot to say. So for me, that offers just one small example of a kind of practice of using the institutional coins, okay, because all these institutions got lots of coins, against what they are intended originally to do. That feels very important to me. And yes, I do see it as a kind of fugitive practice. Also, I am very, very committed to, writing, of course, we have to write a kind of scholarly text, but I also am really committed to writing a kind of text on a trade press that is specifically for more general kinds of audiences that engages topics, right? Like ballroom. And invites audiences beyond academia to think about, to think critically, right? And to invite folks to do that work with me, right? So not centering myself as the knowledge producer who is there to teach you. No, but really writing in a way that will allow people to acknowledge their own brilliance in strategies and the tactics and the tools that they have leveraged to be able to do what we need to do, which is survive and thrive, more importantly. So thank you.
I'll just pop in a tiny bit, as well as the fugitive practices, which I think this is a both and, a multiple and kind of situation. We need, I think, people engaging in fugitive and transgressive and oppositional and activist, and people on the quote inside of power structures also using the power they have. And I feel like I want to think that we have gotten past the time where we would fight amongst ourselves that only respectability politics is the way to go. I think we left that behind 20 years ago. I hope. Maybe not, Julian saying. But ditch some of the, acknowledge that there will be people who will engage what might look like respectability politics. But we, if that person can get my university president's attention in a certain kind of way, great. I also would like people having a die-in on the, on the quad at the same time. So I feel like we need a lot of ways, and we really need, I think one of the ways to do this, we haven't talked much in this call about it, but because maybe it's so obvious now, but like really harnessing media and social media and visuals, because visual is, so salient for people now. So I do feel like there's a lot of different ways to kind of make this work happen. And then I think part of that is sort of educating and training kind of traditionally trained academics on how to do some of that. Like, not only do I not know how to make a TikTok, I certainly don't know how to make my research look like a TikTok. And people of my scholarly generation, so maybe late 90s, I sort of became a faculty person. I still need to be convinced like that's a way to communicate with people, right? Like my college communications people want me to do that. Now I have a feeling that Marquis and Julian, possibly Aaron and Travers also, certainly Jenny, like already know how to do that thing, but like some of it is just learning how to do some of it for those of us who got trained up differently. So I think that a whole range of ways there to kind of make that translate out. And communicating, figuring out what our policymakers will listen to. What does a local school board listen to? How do we get trans-friendly, binary-friendly folks on our local school board? Some of these ways are how we kind of begin to make these changes. Because I will say that the opponents of what we're after are very good at that. They will stack your school board. They will stack your local city council. They will stack your local judiciary. And we need to be more assertive back at that.
So, Chris, I have to say the first thing that came to mind in response to this question was social media. So, I mean, I absolutely think that being a public intellectual is essential, that we're not doing our jobs properly if we just talk to each other, coming back to what I was saying before about the echo chamber. And, just doing academic publications is not going to help activists. We need to be out there in using, we have authority, we have power by virtue of having PhD and doctor or whatever titles we have. That makes people listen to us in a different way. And so, I think we should be out there. We should be writing op-eds. We should be talking to the media as much as possible, the mass media, the traditional media, and absolutely social media. I think it's essential that we are in social media frequently, getting that message, the messages out there. And, not just our messages from our research, but the messages that come to us from the activist community, passing their messages along, because each of us, if we don't, we will have a following. And we should use that following to communicate from other people. You know, there's huge value. Retweeting is huge. Posting things on Facebook, you know, putting something up on Instagram. I don't use TikTok, but I'm sure I will at some point. But you know, there's lots of different social media channels and mass media channels, and I think we need to be there. And you know, Julian, absolutely. I think it's important to publish in if we are publishing and writing books, that those books should be accessible to the public, and they should be written for my goal is always to write at a level that someone who's accustomed to reading, anyone who's accustomed to reading, can read comfortably.
I want to chime in just really quickly. I was holding my tongue, but Julian in particular emboldened me. So if I get in trouble for this, I'm going to kind of blame Julian. But just really quickly, I think I'd encourage folks, and I know I have actually have one student here right now. So there's that. But I will encourage people to get real comfortable breaking the law. And I mean that quite literally. Some people might have disagreement with this, and I get that. But like, especially institutional laws, guidelines, how you can spend your money. I mean, literally just straight up lie to these people and feel no remorse about that. At least that's how I feel. So I encourage us to move in that way, move in that direction, if we are to move toward a more insurgent kind of trans praxis, because the law is deeply trans antagonistic, and deeply not set up to aid the kinds of communities that we're trying to be in service of. So that's my 2 cents, and I'm going to keep it abstract like that, because I don't want to get myself or other folks in any kind of trouble. But yeah, get real comfortable breaking the law. Yeah.
Great. Let's move on to the next question. This is someone, an anonymous attendee asks, as a non-North American person based in the US, I find trans studies to be very America-centric, which is somewhat disheartening finding. Are you aware of any academic efforts to construct a transnational or even international trans studies?
I've actually learned a lot in the Q&A actually right now about scholars who've chimed in. Like, I'm from Sweden, I'm from, like, I'm actually becoming more and more aware of international trans studies right now in the Q&A. So that's going to be where my most immediate pointing out.
Yeah, I'm trying not to monopolize it, but I'm doing it in spite of myself. But I'm waiting for the long silences and people aren't jumping in. So I'll say that the work of the chair in transgender studies is very much internationally focused. You can't really see very well on the wall behind me, but we bring in scholars from all over the world. When I'm able to get funding, this is one of the things I like to use it for. The conference that we just put on, it was all online. It made it more international than usual. And we had people attending from 23 countries on every continent across 13 time zones. Right. So that's pretty international. And the speakers were not all from all 23 countries, but the speakers, I didn't actually count that up, but I would say off the top of my head, were probably from maybe 15 different countries. And so this is something that the Chair in Transgender Studies will continue to do. There are other international conferences, but the ones that I'm aware of that are more, the main one that I'm aware of that's very international is very medicalized. And so that's the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, but it is very, very international. Beyond that, I agree with the person who wrote this in, and I keep referencing back to Blas Radi, who comes from the other chair in Buenos Aires, and this was very much part of his talk. I recommend you have a look at it. It's not been posted yet, but it'll be posted soon on our YouTube channel. And it's very much what he talked about, is how scholars who do not write in English and are not focused on the United States are ignored in the kind of mainstream thrust of what is considered transgender studies. And that's a failing. It's a big failing, and it's something that I think we need to work on.
Other thoughts on this? There's been a lot of questions in the chat asking folks to offer suggestions for readings for further to further their knowledge. And so I was wondering, I'm looking at our time and see we have about 5 minutes left in our panel. And so I was wondering if you each could offer the attendees some suggestions for work that has been influential in your own scholarship, or that you would recommend to folks seeking to further their knowledge in the field. And we don't have to go in the order that I forced you all to go in at the top, so anyone can chime in here.
Dean Spade, Normal Life, and his most recent book, Mutual Aid. He incorporates a prison abolitionist perspective, and it's just fabulous. I also really appreciated the piece on trans necropolitics in, I believe it's the Transgender Studies Reader 2 by Riley Snorton and Jen Haridawarn, as well as the piece by Sarah Lamble, for people who are trying to understand why prison abolition is such an important issue for anti-racism and critical trans politics. Eli Clare, Brilliant Imperfection. Claire is a trans critical disability scholar. Just beautiful, beautiful piece of work. And if you do have the, the time and the willingness to read dense text, that is absolutely brilliant. For sure, Jules Gill Peterson's Histories of the Transgender Child. Like it's a meal and a half, but it's impeccable scholarship, and I think it's very, very important.
I want to second all of those suggestions. So thank you for that. And on the subject of abolition, definitely the collection edited by Eric Stanley and Matt Smith, Captive Genders, absolutely phenomenal text. And I'd also if you're willing to read some dense text, I'd highly recommend C. Riley Snorton's Black on Both Sides: A Racial History of Trans Identity. And I think I already mentioned Hill Malatino's book Trans Care. I think I might also suggest, because I just went back and reread this, Mackenzie Wark's Reverse Cowgirl, which is also a phenomenal text. There's so many that we can name, but those are the ones that come most immediately and readily to mind for me.
Just a note to second C. Riley Snorton's Black on Both Sides. I think it's a text that, it's one of those kind of texts where you don't read it just once or twice or 3 times and understand everything. You're finding new things every time you read it. So just another plug for C. Riley Snorton's Black on Both Sides.
I love that. I'll second also, I was going to say Dean Spade's Mutual Aid. And I understand there's a new encyclopedia out on trans studies from Sage Publishing that you should all read.
Oh yeah. What's that called?
So I think there's a great list of suggestions, and I would endorse all of those. There's one more that I've been looking at. I haven't quite finished it yet, but I think it's quite good. It's Laurel Westbrook, called Unlivable Lives. And I think this is a good book as well to look at.
Something that when I was at the Trans Studies Conference, and I think it was 2017, I watched, I was there for Alexander Wahelehi's presentation, and he introduced me to Sylvia Wynter, and I have gone down a Sylvia Wynter spiral ever since. Brilliant scholar. She's like one of the most brilliant Black feminist scholars, one of the most brilliant scholars I've ever read. So, and she's not completely, but she is under attended to because she is Caribbean in origin rather than, the US perhaps, but also, I mean, she's just, it's unbelievable. So I would have to say, not someone who is doing specifically trans work, but someone who has shaped my own scholarship profoundly. And similarly, Shireen Razak in the Canadian context, who writes about race, space, and the law so that we understand how colonialism actually shapes the lived realities right around us. I mean, and again, she's not speaking specifically about trans issues, but she's had a profound influence on my own scholarship.
And real quick on that note, I'd also suggest Maria Lugones's article, The Coloniality of Gender, also phenomenal and canonical piece too.
I am so sorry that we are out of time. This has been such an amazing event. Wow. On behalf of myself and Abby and the folks at Sage, I want to really thank the panelists for being here. You were just also amazing. And I want to thank you all who were part of the audience for being here. We'll be sending out the links, as I mentioned, to the entries by the wonderful folks here, but we'll also be sending out a reading list of resources that were mentioned in the Q&A, and also we'll be asking the panelists to give us more details about the resources that they shared. So look for that.